Next up, we have a fantastic presenter, Maurice Cherry. Maurice is a designer, strategist, and podcaster located in Atlanta, Georgia. And he's well known for his award-winning podcast, Revision Path, which is actually the first podcast to be added to the permanent collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. So very, very impressive there. Today, he's going to explore the implications of the internet on the general public record, what it means when history can be modified, restricted, or even erased. So very, very excited to hear more from Maurice.
Thank you so much for attending today. Like the slide says, this is content is subject to change. Before I dive into it, though, let me tell you a bit about myself. My name is Maurice Cherry, and I've been around on the internet for a long time. I built my first websites in high school starting in 1996. And I've been a professional working designer in some capacity, freelance or in-house, since 1999. Aside from building websites, I've been an active content creator as well. I started writing online, blogging really, in college in 2001. In 2004, I created an online awards event called the Black Weblog Awards. Started my first podcast in 2005. Launched my design consultancy and studio Lunch in 2008. And created my current podcast, the award-winning Revision Path, in 2013. Since 2018, I've been working as a creative strategist for several startups both here in the US and internationally, helping them with storytelling, design thinking, and most importantly, content. When it comes to the internet, I've pretty much seen it all. But what I've seen recently has really concerned me about the future. As I talk through this, I want to give you the following disclaimer. This presentation is not the solution. This story begins last summer in 2020. NPR called that time the Summer of Racial Reckoning, which is when people got out in the streets and marched and protested police brutality in the wake of a series of murders of Black people at the hands of law enforcement. Seeing people on the news and on social media, well, it got me to thinking about the civil rights movement and how people took to the streets back then in the 1960s to protest. You see, I'm from Selma, Alabama. You've probably heard of it, I'm sure. Selma was where Bloody Sunday took place, which is when a group of civil rights marchers were assaulted and beaten by Alabama state troopers. Images from that brutal attack were televised across the nation and landed on the front pages of newspapers and magazines around the world. This was in 1965. Now, I mentioned that I'm from Selma, and my parents are from Selma as well. They were children at the time, both 13 years old. So when I asked them last summer what they remember from that time, they mostly just recall being at home and hearing about the news as it happened. Why? Well, it's because there were magazines and newspapers along with television to describe and show what was occurring. Ebony magazine, for example, had great in-depth reporting and photos about Bloody Sunday and other events during the civil rights movement, like the March on Montgomery, as we see here on the cover. The Southern Courier, a small newspaper from Montgomery, Alabama, covered stories of local, social, and economic affairs related to the civil rights movement. And Selma's own newspaper, the Selma Times-Journal, featured stories and other perspectives as well. Going 55 years into the future from 1965 brings us to 2020. And thanks to the internet, we're able to access the archives of all these publications online, some for free and some for a nominal cost. As I watched these marches and protests over the summer last year, something stood out to me. Along with mainstream media covering what happened, you had a lot of people sharing and capturing these events via social media. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and other social media platforms were showcasing these protests and marches right alongside professional journalists. And guess where all that content from everyone ended up? Yep, on the internet, making it impossible to look away. Now, this isn't a bad thing for our present reality, but it got me to thinking because we're currently living during a time where we are transforming information at a massive scale. The information age started roughly in the late 60s, early 70s, right around the time of the civil rights movement. With the internet becoming the crucial technology of the information age, and thanks to social media, we are detailing and cataloging our lives online at a staggering pace. For example, in just 1 minute on the internet, 69,000 photos and videos have been shared on Instagram. Also, in 1 minute on the internet, 350,000 tweets have been sent. Add to that the hundreds of thousands of other pieces of information that's being uploaded daily on other platforms, and you have a never ending flood of content. You've heard the saying, the internet never forgets, right? Truthfully, the internet forgets frequently because content is disappearing from the web all the time. Some of that disappearing comes in the form of websites just being deleted. Old articles get scrubbed, whole websites are redesigned with new information architectures, and many web pages just vanish without a care. Some websites just die out, think GeoCities or MySpace or Black Planet, and then they come back from the grave, completely redesigned, but with thousands or more accounts deleted. Have you ever visited an old article, say from 2014 or so, and then discovered every link or image in the article was broken? Maybe that content was moved without any sort of a redirect, or worse, the original content has been completely overwritten or just deleted altogether. I used to use a website called itweet.net back in 2013 or so. It was basically an alternate way to post to Twitter. Now it's a website about how to get rich with a money wallet, something completely different. These examples point to a larger overall issue. While we are adding hundreds of thousands of pieces of information to the internet, the truth is that the internet is rotting every minute. This continuous decay of older information is certainly cause for concern, but there's another layer to this conversation, which is the real-time transmutation of information in the present. Deepfake technology, which uses artificial intelligence and machine learning, allows people to not just change faces like you see here, Steve Buscemi in place of Jennifer Lawrence, but you can also change what someone says in the video simply by typing whatever you want your subject to say. This image that you see here is from a project in 2019 done by scientists from Princeton University, Stanford University, Adobe Research, and the Max Planck Institute for Informatics. On TikTok, people are editing real users' videos and creating deepfakes to promote all kinds of racist sentiments. These videos are appearing at a rate much faster than the platform could even delete them. This isn't just happening on the social media level either. World-renowned chef turned media personality Anthony Bourdain's recent documentary, Roadrunner, recreated his voice to say some lines in the film, and these are things he'd never even said while he was alive. Bourdain's ex-wife, Otavia Bourdain, later stated that she certainly was not the one who said Tony would have been cool with that. This is also happening with academic journals, judicial opinions, Wikipedia articles, and even ebooks. Authors such as Ellen Hilderbrand have reached out to publishers to remove certain passages from their novels which have caused negative public sentiment. In Hilderbrand's case, this retroactive correction happened with an anti-Semitic passage she wrote for her novel, Golden Girl. Also with Kindles, the books don't really even live on the internet because there's no URL for them. The content is in a liminal space on a server somewhere being fetched and downloaded to a device. Now, you might be thinking from looking at all this, well, what about the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine? Well, let's talk about that. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit founded in 1996 whose purpose is to preserve archived versions of web pages. The Wayback Machine is a digital archive from the Internet Archive. But as you may have guessed by now, the Wayback Machine can't archive everything. It can't archive pages with Flash. If the web page isn't coded using HTML, it can't be archived. It can't even archive every hyperlink on every page. Oh, and it's also blocked in China, the world's most populous country. Web archivists have spoken to the technical challenges of archiving the internet, but there's also the matter of intellectual property. There are copyright implications for crawling, storing, and displaying old web pages. And in the past, companies and publishers have sued the Internet Archive for offering up such items as scanned books to the public. It's a conundrum. We can't exactly freeze the internet as it is, given how much information is added, which makes web archiving both an active and extremely daunting task. Research engineers like Zeynep Pelivan, pictured here, have documented this and spoken to many national libraries around the world that have undertaken steps to archive and preserve the internet. I definitely would recommend checking out her talk on YouTube, Web Archiving, Collection for the Now for the Future. It's really fascinating and speaks to the strategy and methods archivists use. This is where things are as of 2020. But what happens if we continue along this pace? Namely, what will the state of information on the internet look like in 2075? With the current state of media conglomerates like AT&T, Warner Media, Disney, Viacom, etc., along with publishers like Verizon Media and IDG being bought by private equity, there is no real guarantee that the websites, news organizations, publications, or social media platforms we currently know will even exist 55 years into the future, let alone consider preserving these massive amounts of content. Or if they do, will we even be able to access that content as we're currently able to access the magazines and newspapers of 55 years in the past from now? What if people in 2075 try to search for content online about what happened during the summer of 2020 and find a bunch of news articles with broken links and images? What if people in 2075 do their research on the summer of 2020 and uncover fake images and deepfake videos describing events which never transpired? Or worse, what if they can't find anything at all? Like I said earlier, this presentation is not a solution. But hopefully this gives you an idea of the not so near future of content because, as you can clearly see, it is definitely subject to change. Any questions?
Thank you, Maurice. That was fascinating and super thought-provoking.
Thank you. And again, thank you for having me at this conference. This was a new talk. It was something that I had been sort of pondering for a while. And so I'm glad to be able to share it first with the audience here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's certainly a topic that impacts all of us and pretty much everything we do at this point, and I think kind of runs tangential to financial services in a lot of ways. So
Oh,
I do have a
absolutely. I
couple.
mean, oh, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please. I'll hold off on questions to finish.
No, I was going to say, even as I think about, how this would relate to finance, because that was an initial thought of mine as I put the talk together. I even thought about how banks have changed over the years. I mean, banks will merge, they've changed names. Even now, just, most recently, the bank that I've had has changed over 3 times within the past about 6 months. And so I think about what does that mean in terms of content? What does that mean in terms of just brand sentiment in general? So I think it's something that even people in this audience, in this particular industry, can sort of take to heart.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In my mind, kind of, I went to this idea, this thought of the financial world is becoming increasingly digital, and you talked about altered actions, deep fakes, things like that. And it's possible that someone could replicate a service of some kind. Or I just got asked about voice verification with my bank. Those are things that could easily be replicated. It feels like, or at least we're trending in that direction, which is scary, certainly.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I feel like, email, for example, is still a point of penetration that's really sensitive for a lot of people. You get phishing scams and things of that nature. if it looks official enough, someone might think it's official, and then you run into all sorts of issues there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the people in this room and in this audience, I think this is a group that does have some control to an extent over digital properties, especially in
Mhm.
finance. And is there anything that, in your mind, we can be doing or pushing our employers to do so that we can kind of maintain a little bit more integrity in the space?
Oh, absolutely. And this is something that, now that I am listening back to my presentation, I should have thought about including. But financial institutions definitely need to start instituting some web governance policies. As I sort of mentioned before, there might be this reliance from a lot of organizations on the Internet Archive, which is just a single nonprofit that is archiving information. Of course, you also have web archivists at different libraries and things around the world that are doing this, but we saw all of the types of limitations that this has in terms of content, based on how the page is built, the architecture, any other elements on the page. So what you put up there may or may not exist later on down the line. If companies start instituting web governance policies, what they can do is put in place measures to archive and store data, to include it in simple text format that people can find later. I am not seeing this a lot. Honestly, I work mostly in the tech industry, and I don't see it a lot even in that industry where you would think it would be most paramount. So, for financial information, for financial institutions, it's something that should be considered, just instituting some basic web governance policies. There's a fabulous book by Lisa Welchman about web governance that I think a lot of people should check out. I don't have the title of it off the top of my head, but I know she does web governance for governing entities as well as organizations, and it's a fascinating look into how companies can start to institute those types of practices for themselves.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I think it almost becomes a cultural thing too of having an employer or a company recognize this is important and then kind of trying to build a culture of digital integrity, I guess, for lack of a better word. Um, we were kind of reminded today earlier. There was a section about Cambridge Analytica and kind of some improper use of data, and some implications there. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about how we can balance this need to remember and have a consistent record with things like right to be forgotten and a person's ability to have their private information removed from internet searches, which I know is kind of a topic right now.
Mhm.
So those seem to be at odds. So I'm curious to get your thoughts.
I'd say you're absolutely right. Those things are at odds, particularly as we see more just countries start to institute lots of policies around, user data and customer privacy. We have GDPR, for example, in the UK, and there's other countries that have or are starting to sort of institute other types of policies for web giants like Facebook and Google, giving, and putting policies in place that will protect user data, that will allow user privacy, things of that nature. It is a bit, it can feel like sort of oil and water in a way, like these two things don't really mix. I think private institutions, as I mentioned before, with web governance, need to really think about their think about their own policies as it relates to user data, because that's going to be just as important as a person's financial data, if not more. I think we always hear about in the news different data breaches, hundreds of thousands of possibly millions of pieces of user data just out there on the web somewhere. Um, if companies have their own web governance policies and web data policies in place for user data, that's one way to try to circumvent that, but it's really tricky. I mean, I say this now because the nature of the web is still this ever-changing medium. Even with what I talked about now, who's to say that in 5 or 10 years these policies won't, now be defunct? Uh, the same sort of thing around storage and user privacy. So as the technology increases, I think it does become increasingly hard to kind of really put rules and boundaries around this, but it's something that companies, particularly around the state of governance, need to start thinking about.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. It's almost this, you want to take this futures thinking lens when you kind of think about all this stuff because it is changing. You want to kind of think about, where we could end up and where we want to end up and how we kind of try to make that happen. For you, as someone who's worked in creative design, marketing, content, kind of since the internet started, is there anything that you've started doing differently in terms of the content you produce since you started realizing this was happening?
Oh, absolutely. I've started for my own data and projects creating multiple points of backup. So I have local backups, I have network assisted storage backups, I have cloud backups. Because if one thing fails, then maybe I can get information from another place. But also, I've been a little bit hesitant to go into more newer technologies like NFTs or the metaverse or things like that, because while these are very sort of bleeding edge, cutting edge technologies, there's still a very sort of murky gray area around privacy and usage and any other sort of norms that we've already kind of hashed out with the internet in its current state that don't really exist yet for these new technologies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, all good points. So, Maurice, again, thank you so much for being here. I think this topic is one we need to start thinking about. So, I really appreciate you helping us start that conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much for having me.